You know, if you had asked me a year ago, I'd have told you that my marriage was solid. I'd have rattled off the usual cliches about love, trust, and all those other fairy tale concepts they feed you in romance movies. And, to be fair, there was a time when it felt true. Hannah and I were the golden couple, or so everyone thought. People envied our life together. The beautiful house, the quiet suburb, and a marriage that, on the surface, seemed perfect. But here's the thing about perfection. It's often just a mask. I inherited the house from my mom when she passed. It wasn't just any house. It was her dream. My parents had worked their entire lives to build it from the ground up, brick by brick. So, for me, this house wasn't just a roof over my head. It was memories, warmth, and a reminder of where I came from. Hannah loved the house, or at least she said she did. I think what she really loved was what the house represented. Stability, status, and, most importantly, something she could boast about to her friends. Hannah was always ambitious, but in a way that made me feel like I was always playing catch-up. She came from a wealthy family, the kind that measured success in designer handbags and exotic vacations. Me? I was the steady one, the practical one. I worked a good job in accounting, nothing flashy, but it paid the bills, and I was proud of what I did. Hannah, though, never missed an opportunity to remind me that I could dream bigger. For the first few years, I thought her nagging came from a place of love. She wanted me to push myself, right? To be better? But somewhere along the way, it started feeling less like encouragement and more like thinly veiled contempt. The dinners where she'd laugh a little too loudly at her friends' jokes about boring accountants. The way she'd casually suggest that maybe I should let her handle the finances because numbers weren't my thing. And the look she'd give me when we were around her parents. This mix of pity and irritation, like I was some underachieving project she couldn't quite fix. But I loved her. Or maybe I loved the idea of her. I loved the way she lit up a room, the way she seemed to have this magnetic pull that drew people to her. I convinced myself that if I just worked a little harder, earned a little more, maybe she'd see me as enough. So I buried myself in work, thinking that if I could give her the life she wanted, the snide comments would stop. Spoiler alert, they didn't. There were good moments, of course. I won't lie and say it was all bad. There were lazy Sunday mornings where we'd make pancakes together in the kitchen. Nights spent watching old movies, her head resting on my shoulder. Times when I'd look at her and think, how did I get so lucky? But even in those moments, there was this undercurrent of something unspoken, a tension that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Looking back, the signs were all there. The subtle shifts in her tone when she spoke to me. The way her phone was always face down on the table. The nights she'd come home later and later, with excuses that didn't quite add up. But I ignored them. I told myself that all couples go through rough patches, that this was just a phase, and we'd come out stronger on the other side. I think the hardest part was how easily she could turn on the charm when she wanted to. Whenever I started to feel like maybe I was losing her, she'd pull me back in with a smile, a kiss, or a whispered, "I love you." And I believed her. Every single time. People always talk about the moment they knew their marriage was over. For me, there wasn't a single moment. It was a slow, painful unraveling. Like a thread being pulled loose from a sweater, little by little, until there's nothing left but a tangled mess. But at this point in the story, I was still holding on to that thread, hoping I could somehow weave it back together. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I wasn't blind. I saw the cracks. I just wasn't ready to admit that they were there. Denial is a funny thing, isn't it? It convinces you that you're still living in the perfect picture, even when the frame is falling apart. Hannah played her role well. She smiled for the photos, hosted dinner parties, and acted like the doting wife when it suited her. And I played my role too, the hardworking husband who just wanted to make her happy. But deep down, I think we both knew the truth. Our perfect picture was just an illusion, and the cracks were about to become impossible to ignore. The thing about illusions, though, is that they always shatter eventually. And when ours did, it wasn't just a crack. It was a full-blown explosion. But that's a story for later. For now, let's just say that I was still clinging to the hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to the life we used to have. Foolish, isn't it? If the first few years of our marriage were the picture-perfect dream, then the next few were the slow, agonizing wake-up call. Looking back, I can pinpoint the exact moments when the cracks began to show, but at the time, I convinced myself they were nothing. Tiny arguments here and there. A few raised eyebrows when I suggested a budget. Her sigh of annoyance when I asked how her day was. Things every married couple goes through, right? That's what I told myself. But deep down, I knew better. The first real sign? Her nights out. At first, it was harmless. "It's just a girls' night," she'd say with a dismissive wave of her hand. And I believed her. Why wouldn't I? Hannah had always been social, the life of the party. I figured a little time with her friends was good for her. And to be honest, it was good for me, too. I enjoyed the quiet evenings to myself, catching up on work or indulging in a movie she'd roll her eyes at if I suggested we watch together. But then the girls' nights became more frequent. Weekly at first, then twice a week, then 3. And every time she came home a little later, smelling faintly of something I couldn't quite place. Not perfume, not alcohol, something else. Something I didn't want to think too much about. "Work's just been stressful," she said when I finally asked her about it. "I need to blow off some steam." It sounded reasonable enough. I wanted to believe it. So I nodded, smiled, and let it go. That's what you do when you trust someone, right? You give them the benefit of the doubt. But then there were the receipts. I found the first one while cleaning out the car. A boutique I'd never heard of. A $400 charge for, what? A dress? Shoes? I wasn't sure, but I knew one thing. Hannah hadn't worn anything new around me in months. "Isn't this a little pricey?" I asked her later, holding the receipt out to her. "Oh, that?" She glanced at it, barely looking up from her phone. "That was for Tasha's birthday gift. You know how she loves her designer stuff." It sounded plausible. Tasha was one of her closest friends, and yes, she had a taste for the finer things in life. But something about the way Hannah said it felt off. There was no warmth in her tone, no mention of how much Tasha had loved the gift. Just a cold, clinical explanation designed to shut me up. The next one came a week later, this time in her coat pocket. A dinner receipt for 2 at an upscale restaurant. A place I'd always wanted to try, but we'd never gone because, according to Hannah, it's too expensive for something as silly as dinner. "Did you take Tasha here too?" I asked, forcing a smile as I handed her the receipt. She didn't even blink. "Work dinner," she said. "You know I have to entertain clients sometimes." This time, I didn't say anything. What could I say? Her explanation made sense. But the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach didn't go away. Then there was the phone. I'd never been the kind of husband who snooped. It just wasn't in my nature. But when you're sitting on the couch next to your wife, and she suddenly tilts her phone away from you every time a message comes in, yeah, it starts to get to you. "Who's that?" I asked one evening, keeping my tone casual. "Just work stuff," she replied, locking the screen and placing the phone face down on the coffee table. Every instinct I had was screaming at me that something wasn't right. But again, I pushed it down. Accusing your wife of hiding something without proof? That wasn't who I was. I didn't want to be the jealous, paranoid husband. So I let it go. And then came the ultimate blow to my pride. The finances. We'd always kept our accounts separate. It was something Hannah insisted on when we got married. "It's just easier that way," she'd said, and I hadn't argued. But one day, out of the blue, she suggested that maybe it was time for her to take over the household budget. "You're so busy with work," she said sweetly. "I just think it would be easier for both of us if I handled it. You trust me, don't you?" And there it was. That word, trust. I'd always prided myself on trusting her, on being the kind of husband who didn't micromanage or hover. So I handed her the reins, telling myself it was just one less thing for me to worry about. It wasn't until months later that I realized how naive I'd been. The cracks weren't just cracks anymore. They were gaping holes, and I was doing everything I could to pretend they didn't exist. Because admitting the truth, admitting that my marriage, the life I'd built with the woman I loved, was falling apart, that felt like a failure I wasn't ready to face. But the truth has a way of catching up to you, whether you're ready for it or not. And for me, it was barreling down the road at full speed, about to hit me head on. I still remember the night it all came crashing down. They say you never forget the moment your world shifts beneath you, and trust me, they're right. It was a Tuesday, a completely ordinary day that ended in the kind of chaos you only see in soap operas. Except this time, I was the main character. Lucky me. Hannah came home around 8 p.m., earlier than usual for one of her so-called work meetings. I was in the kitchen, finishing the dishes, when I heard the front door open and her heels click against the hardwood floor. But it wasn't just her footsteps I heard. There was another set, heavier, more deliberate. My first thought was that maybe she brought a friend over. Maybe Tasha was here to borrow something, or a neighbor needed help. I wiped my hands on a towel and turned around, ready to greet whoever it was. And then I saw him. He strolled in behind her like he owned the place, tall, smug, and oozing arrogance. His tailored suit and flashy watch screamed money, but his grin? His grin was the kind that made you want to punch someone. "This is Victor," Hannah said casually, as if introducing me to her new coworker. But the way she stood closer to him than she ever stood to me, the way his hand brushed her lower back as he walked past her, that told me everything I needed to know. "Victor?" I asked, keeping my voice steady even though my hands were trembling. "Yes," she said, her tone clipped and matter-of-fact. "He'll be staying with us for a while." It took me a second to process her words. "Staying with us?" She rolled her eyes like I was being slow on purpose. "He's moving in, James. We've decided this arrangement makes the most sense. You can stay in the spare room. It's not like you're using the master bedroom much these days anyway." I should have felt something, anger, betrayal, heartbreak. But in that moment, all I felt was numb. It was like my brain couldn't fully comprehend what was happening. My wife, the woman I'd built my life around, had just walked into our home with another man and told me, with zero shame, that he'd be living here. Victor smirked at me, like he'd already won whatever sick game this was. No hard feelings, right? I'm sure this is a bit of a shock, but it'll all work out in the end. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. No hard feelings? The man was standing in my house, smiling at me like I was some minor inconvenience he had to deal with. Hannah, on the other hand, looked bored, like she couldn't understand why I wasn't immediately agreeing to her ridiculous plan. "It's not like we're asking you to leave, James," she said. "We're being fair about this." Fair. That word hit me like a slap in the face. Fair? What part of this was fair? The woman I loved had replaced me, and now she wanted me to live under the same roof as the guy she'd chosen over me? But here's the thing about betrayal. It does something to you. It strips away every illusion you've clung to and forces you to see the truth. In that moment, I realized something I should have seen a long time ago. Hannah didn't love me. Maybe she never did. And you know what? That was fine. Because while she'd been busy tearing me down, I'd been preparing for this exact moment. I smiled at her, really smiled, and watched as confusion flickered across her face. "You're right," I said, my voice calm and even. "This arrangement makes perfect sense." Her eyes narrowed, trying to figure out if I was joking. Victor looked just as confused, but I didn't give them time to respond. "I'll get out of your way," I said, grabbing my coat and heading for the door. "James," Hannah started, but I didn't let her finish. "I'll leave you two to settle in," I said, turning back to flash one last smile. "Enjoy the house while you can." And with that, I walked out. Not because I was giving up, but because I knew I didn't need to fight. Hannah had no idea what I'd been planning for weeks. And as I drove away that night, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and satisfaction, I knew one thing for certain. She'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. I didn't drive far that night, just enough to clear my head and let the adrenaline subside. I parked at the lot of an all-night diner, the kind of place where no one asks questions if you sit quietly in a booth with a cup of coffee and your thoughts. That's exactly what I needed, time to think. But the funny thing is, I didn't feel as broken as I thought I would. If anything, I felt prepared. You see, this moment, Hannah walking in with her smug little boyfriend and treating me like a guest in my own life, didn't come out of nowhere. The signs had been there for months. And as much as I'd wanted to believe the lies, part of me had known the truth all along. And that part of me, the part that still had a shred of self-respect, It had been planning for this. I started thinking about it the day she suggested I hand over control of the finances. Something about the way she said it, so sweet, so reasonable, set off alarm bells in my head. She wasn't asking to help, she was asking to take. And if she was willing to cross that line, what else was she capable of? So I started looking into things. At first, it was just curiosity. I'd glance at the bank statements when they came in, noticing small withdrawals here and there. Nothing major, but enough to make me wonder where the money was going. Then there were the credit card charges, boutiques, restaurants, hotels I'd never heard of. That's when I knew. But I didn't confront her. No, that would have been too easy. Hannah was the type who thrived on arguments, twisting words until you didn't even remember what you were fighting about in the first place. I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Instead, I decided to protect myself. The house was the first thing I focused on. She thought it was ours, but it wasn't. It was mine. My name was the only one on the deed, and I intended to keep it that way. I reached out to a real estate agent, a discreet one, just to see what my options were. To my surprise, the market was hot, and the house could fetch a lot more than I expected. At first, I hesitated. Selling the house felt like giving up, like letting her win. But then I thought about all the memories tied to it. Good ones, yes, but also the bad ones. The arguments. The cold silences. The nights I sat alone in the living room, wondering if I was the only one still trying to make this marriage work. No, the house wasn't my home anymore. It was a battleground, and I was done fighting. So I made the call. Quietly, carefully. The agent found a buyer almost immediately, some wealthy couple looking for a summer retreat. They wanted to move fast, and so did I. Within weeks, the paperwork was signed, and the deal was done. But I didn't stop there. I transferred my savings to a new account, one she didn't know about, and started closing the joint accounts we'd opened early in our marriage. She hadn't touched them in years anyway, preferring to keep her money separate. I also started packing. Not in a dramatic way, but little by little, when she wasn't home. A box here, a suitcase there. Just the essentials, clothes, personal items, the things that mattered. By the time she walked in with Victor, thinking she was about to take over my life, I was already halfway out the door. And the car? Oh, that was the cherry on top. I'd been driving the same beat-up sedan since college, and Hannah never missed an opportunity to remind me how embarrassing it was. "You're an accountant, James," she'd say with that condescending tone I hated. "You should drive something that reflects your success." Well, she got her wish. I traded in the sedan and used part of the house sale money to buy myself a brand new luxury SUV. The kind that turned heads. The kind that said, "I've moved on, and I'm doing just fine without you." So as I sat in that diner, sipping my coffee and watching the clock tick closer to midnight, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Control. Hannah thought she'd won. She thought she could waltz in with her boyfriend, take what she wanted, and leave me with the scraps. But she didn't know what I knew. She didn't know that the house wasn't hers to take, that the accounts were already empty, that the life she thought she was walking into didn't exist anymore. And the best part? I hadn't said a word. Because sometimes, silence is the loudest message you can send. When I walked back into the house the next morning, the air was thick with the smugness radiating from Hannah and her new boyfriend, Victor. They were sitting at the dining table, laughing over coffee like they were already the new king and queen of the castle. It was surreal, watching them make themselves at home in a place that wasn't even theirs. Hannah turned to me with a look I can only describe as victorious. "Good morning," she chirped, her tone dripping with fake sweetness. "Did you sleep well?" I ignored her question, walking straight past them to the living room. I had one final piece of business to take care of, and I wasn't about to waste time pretending to play nice. "James, don't be rude," she called after me, her voice sharp now. "Victor and I were just talking about the renovations we're planning for the master bedroom. It's going to be so much better once we redecorate." That stopped me in my tracks. I turned slowly, meeting her gaze with a calmness I didn't actually feel. "Renovations?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. Victor smirked, leaning back in his chair like he was some kind of king on his throne. "Yeah, man. This place has potential, but it's a little outdated, don't you think? We were thinking of knocking down a wall or two, maybe opening up the space." Modernize it. I stared at him for a long moment, letting the weight of his arrogance settle in. He had no idea what was coming, and honestly, I was looking forward to the moment when that smirk disappeared from his face. Sounds ambitious, I said finally, keeping my tone light. You might want to hold off on those plans, though. There's something you should know. Hannah rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed that I wasn't groveling or sulking like she expected. What is it now, James? She snapped. Whatever it is, I'm sure it can wait. Victor and I have a lot to do today. I smiled, really smiled, and took a deep breath. Actually, it can't wait. See, I sold the house yesterday. The room went silent. For a moment, they just stared at me, as if they hadn't heard me correctly. Then Hannah let out a sharp laugh, the kind she used when she was trying to mask her discomfort. That's ridiculous, she said. You're not serious. Oh, I'm very serious, I replied, pulling a folded document from my pocket and laying it on the table in front of them. Here's the proof. The sale went through yesterday morning. The new owners will be here in about an hour, so you might want to start packing. Victor's smirk vanished. He grabbed the document, his eyes scanning the fine print. This can't be real, he muttered, his voice shaking slightly. It's real, I said, my tone calm but firm, and legally binding. I'm sure you, of all people, understand how contracts work, Victor. Hannah's face turned red, a mix of rage and disbelief. You can't do this, she shouted, slamming her hands on the table. This is our house, James. You had no right. It's my house, I interrupted, my voice cutting through her rant like a knife. It always has been. My name is the only one on the deed, Hannah. You didn't care about that when you were busy redecorating the master bedroom, did you? Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For once, she was speechless. Victor, on the other hand, wasn't giving up so easily. This is a low move, man, he said, standing up and towering over me like he thought he could intimidate me. You think this makes you the bigger person? I tilted my head, meeting his glare without flinching. I think it makes me someone who doesn't let people walk all over him anymore. You can see yourself out, Victor, or wait for the new owners to throw you out. Your call. Hannah's voice rose again, desperate now. You'll regret this, James. You can't just walk away and leave me with nothing. I leaned in, my voice low and steady. You walked away from this marriage a long time ago, Hannah. I'm just catching up. And with that, I turned and walked out the door. As I stepped into my new car, the one I'd bought with the money from the house, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, satisfaction, and yes, a little bit of sadness. Despite everything, there was a part of me that had truly loved her once. But that part was gone now, replaced by a stronger, smarter version of myself. I glanced back at the house one last time as I pulled out of the driveway, watching as Hannah and Victor scrambled to figure out what to do next. It wasn't my problem anymore. For the first time in years, I was free. I didn't look back after that. I didn't need to. Watching Hannah and Victor stumble over their misplaced confidence as I drove off was all the closure I thought I'd ever need. I hit the highway, my hands steady on the wheel of my new SUV, and let the rush of freedom wash over me. For the first time in years, I felt light. The weight of years of compromise, disappointment, and heartbreak had lifted off my shoulders. It wasn't just about selling the house or cutting ties with Hannah. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my life, and my future. I drove for hours that day, with no real destination in mind. The road stretched ahead like an open canvas, and for once, I felt like the artist in control of my own story. The radio played softly in the background, but I wasn't really listening. My mind was replaying the events of that morning, savoring every detail of the look on their faces when I told them the house was sold. Hannah's expression had been priceless. The disbelief, the panic, the rage. It was a cocktail of emotions she'd never shown me before. She had always been so composed, so sure of herself, so convinced that she was untouchable. Watching her crumble in real time was more satisfying than I ever could have imagined. And Victor? That smug grin wiped clean off his face was the cherry on top. He'd walked into my life like he owned it, but he didn't even know what game he was playing. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. After a few hours, I found myself at a quiet lakeside park. I parked the car, grabbed a coffee from a nearby cafe, and sat on a bench overlooking the water. The cool breeze was refreshing, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to just be still. No worrying about bills, no overthinking my marriage, no tiptoeing around someone else's expectations. I thought about Hannah and Victor, about what they were doing at that very moment. They'd probably scrambled to pack up their things and get out before the new owners arrived. I imagined Victor frantically Googling cheap motels while Hannah tried to figure out how to spin this disaster into a story that didn't make her look like the villain. But no matter how they tried to twist it, the truth was clear. They had underestimated me. It's funny, isn't it? People like Hannah and Victor thrive on the belief that others will always bend to their will. They bank on their targets being too passive, too scared, or too naive to fight back. And for a long time, I had been all of those things. I'd let Hannah chip away at my confidence, dismiss my efforts, and treat me like an accessory to her life. But that chapter was over. As the sun began to set over the lake, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a call from an unknown number. I didn't even have to look at the screen to know who it was. I let it ring. Then it rang again, and again. Finally, curiosity got the better of me, and I answered. Hello? James. Her voice was frantic, panicked. James, you have to fix this. I didn't say anything, letting her words hang in the air. Victor, he's furious. He's blaming me for everything. We're stranded. I don't have anywhere to go. You can't just leave us like this. Sure I can, I said calmly. And I did. James, please, she begged, her voice breaking. We can work something out. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I almost laughed at the desperation in her tone. The tables had turned, and she was finally feeling the sting of her own arrogance. But I wasn't interested in giving her any more of my time or energy. Good luck, Hannah, I said, my voice steady. You're going to need it. I hung up before she could respond and blocked her number for good measure. As I walked back to my car, the satisfaction I felt wasn't about revenge. It was about freedom. Hannah and Victor's chaos was no longer my burden to carry. I had spent so much of my life trying to make other people happy, trying to live up to their expectations, and for what? To be cast aside when I wasn't convenient anymore? Not anymore. That night, I checked into a cozy little motel, ordered myself a steak dinner, and slept better than I had in years. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like a good thing. Sometimes, losing everything is the best way to find yourself. And I had a feeling I was just getting started. The days following that morning were nothing short of blissful. For the first time in years, I wasn't waking up with a knot in my stomach, wondering what new criticism or cold remark Hannah would toss my way. Instead, I woke up in quiet hotel rooms, surrounded by nothing but my own thoughts. I didn't rush to rebuild my life. That's the thing no one tells you. You don't have to rush. Sometimes, the best way to move forward is to take your time, to let the dust settle and rediscover who you are outside of the chaos. I'd sold the house for more than I ever thought it was worth, and with the cash safely tucked away, I was free to start over. I even started sketching plans for what my next move would look like. Maybe a new city, maybe a new job. Hell, maybe even a new career entirely. The world felt wide open, and for the first time in years, I wasn't scared of what lay ahead. Then came the call. It was late one afternoon while I was parked by a riverside, finishing a sandwich from a food truck. My phone buzzed, and when I glanced at the screen, I saw a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I wouldn't have answered, but something told me to pick up. James speaking, I said, keeping my tone neutral. James! The voice on the other end was unmistakable, even with the edge of desperation. It was Victor. I didn't say anything, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him squirm. Look, he said finally, his usual smugness replaced by something closer to panic. I don't know how to say this, but we need to talk. It's about the house. I raised an eyebrow, though of course he couldn't see it. What about the house? The deed, he stammered. There's something wrong with the deed. Hannah and I, well, we assumed everything was above board, but... Stop, I cut him off, my voice sharp. Let me save you some time. The house is no longer my problem. Whatever issue you're having, take it up with the new owners. That's the thing, he said, his voice rising in frustration. There aren't any new owners. The sale, it fell through. That caught my attention. What? The couple you sold it to, apparently their financing didn't go through. The house is back on the market, James. And Hannah, she's furious. I leaned back in my seat, letting his words sink in. So the house hadn't sold after all. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of disappointment. But then I realized something. This was an opportunity. Victor continued rambling, his voice a mix of pleading and desperation. We don't have anywhere to go. Hannah, she's blaming me for everything. She says this is all my fault, that I ruined her life. I don't know what to do, man. I couldn't help but laugh. It wasn't a loud, mocking laugh, just a quiet chuckle at the sheer irony of it all. Victor, I said finally, my voice calm and measured. Let me get this straight. You and Hannah walked into my home, treated me like an afterthought, and now you expect me to help you because things didn't go the way you planned? He didn't respond, but the silence was answer enough. Let me make this simple for you, I continued. I don't care about the house, and I don't care about you or Hannah. You made your bed, Victor. Now you get to lie in it. I hung up before he could respond, feeling a sense of closure I hadn't expected. The twist wasn't just that the house was still technically mine. It was that I no longer felt tied to it. For so long, that house had been a symbol of my past, of my failures, of a marriage that was doomed from the start. But now, it was just another piece of property. The next morning, I called the real estate agent and told her to put the house back on the market. Take your time finding the right buyer, I said. I'm in no rush. As for Hannah and Victor, I didn't hear from them again. Whether they found another place to stay or ended up squabbling in a cheap motel somewhere, I didn't care. Their chaos was no longer my concern. Life has a funny way of throwing you curveballs, doesn't it? What started as the worst moment of my life had turned into the greatest turning point. And as I stood on the deck of that riverside cafe, sipping my coffee and watching the water ripple in the sunlight, I realized something. I hadn't just sold a house. I'd sold my past. And the future? Well, that was entirely mine to build. After that final call from Victor, something shifted in me. It wasn't just the satisfaction of knowing that Hannah and Victor were left to face the mess they'd created. It was the realization that, for the first time in years, I was completely free. Free from their drama. Free from the weight of trying to hold a broken marriage together. Free to start over. I didn't rush back to town. Instead, I stayed on the road for a while, exploring places I'd only ever seen in passing. Small towns, winding mountain roads, coastal cities. I let the journey guide me. It wasn't about running away. It was about rediscovering who I was outside of the labels that had defined me for so long. Husband, provider, pushover. The house was officially back on the market, and I trusted my agent to handle everything. I told her to contact me only when the sale was final. I didn't need updates or questions about the process. The house was no longer my problem. It was a relic of a life I'd outgrown. I found myself in a small lakeside town one evening, the kind of place where the air smelled like pine and the sunsets painted the water in shades of gold and orange. There was a cozy bed and breakfast on the edge of town, and the owner, a warm, grandmotherly woman named Eileen, greeted me with a smile that felt like home. "You look like a man who's been carrying the weight of the world," she said as she handed me the key to my room. "But don't worry, we have a way of lightening the load around here." And she was right. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping and the scent of fresh coffee wafting through the air. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the familiar knot of anxiety in my chest. I felt peaceful. Eileen served breakfast in the sunlit dining room, and as I sipped my coffee, I struck up a conversation with a few of the other guests. Travelers, retirees, locals dropping in for a warm meal. It was a mixed crowd, but there was something refreshing about the simplicity of it all. One of the guests, a retired architect named Henry, noticed the brochure I'd picked up about local properties. "Thinking of staying a while?" he asked, his tone casual. I hadn't been, not at first. But the more I thought about it, the more the idea appealed to me. This town, with its quiet streets and friendly faces, felt like the perfect place to start fresh. I might be, I said, surprising myself. Henry chuckled. Well, if you need any advice, let me know. I've been around the block a few times. Over the next few days, I explored the town, chatting with locals and soaking in the slower pace of life. There was something healing about the stillness, about the way people greeted each other by name and took the time to actually listen. I found a small cabin for sale on the edge of the lake, surrounded by tall pines and wildflowers. It wasn't anything fancy, but it had character. A wraparound porch, a stone fireplace, and enough space to feel like a sanctuary without being overwhelming. The seller, an older gentleman named Frank, was more interested in finding the right buyer than in making a profit. This place has been good to me, he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. I just want it to go to someone who'll appreciate it. I put in an offer the same day, and by the end of the week, the cabin was mine. Moving in was a process, but it felt different this time. Every piece of furniture I picked out, every box I unpacked, felt like a step toward building a life that was entirely my own. The first night in the cabin, I lit a fire in the fireplace and sat on the porch with a glass of wine, watching the moonlight dance on the lake. The silence was comforting, not oppressive. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of peace. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was running or hiding. I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. Hannah and Victor had faded into the background of my life, their chaos nothing more than a distant memory. I didn't know what had happened to them after that last call, and I didn't care to find out. They were a chapter I'd closed, and I wasn't interested in reopening it. Life wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was mine, and that was enough. Months passed, and life in my little lakeside cabin became the kind of calm I hadn't thought possible. I'd settled into a new routine. Early mornings by the water, afternoons spent tinkering around the cabin, and evenings by the fireplace with a good book. It wasn't glamorous, but it was peaceful. I'd found work helping a local business owner with bookkeeping. It wasn't anything close to the corporate grind I'd left behind, but it paid enough to keep the bills in check and left me with plenty of time to enjoy my new life. Hannah and Victor? They were distant memories, the kind you occasionally revisit just to remind yourself how far you've come. I hadn't heard from them since Victor's panicked call about the failed house sale. The real estate agent eventually found a new buyer, and the house was finally sold, severing my last tie to that part of my life. Or so I thought. One Saturday afternoon, I decided to take a drive into the nearest city for supplies. It wasn't a trip I made often. The town had most of what I needed, but every now and then, I liked the change of scenery. I was browsing the aisles of a hardware store, debating whether or not I needed a new set of tools, when I heard a voice I hadn't expected to hear again. James. I turned, and there she was. Hannah. She looked different. Not in the glamorous, polished way I'd grown used to seeing her. Her hair was unkempt, her clothes wrinkled, and there was a weariness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. For a moment, I didn't say anything, unsure of how to respond. "It is you," she said, her voice a mixture of surprise and relief. I didn't think I'd ever see you again." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "Hannah." She gave me a weak smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You look good," she said, her tone hesitant. "Thanks," I replied. "You look different." It wasn't meant to be cruel, just honest. And by the way her face fell, I could tell she knew exactly what I meant. "Life's been hard," she admitted, looking down at the floor. "Victor and I, well, that didn't work out. Turns out he wasn't exactly the man he pretended to be." I didn't respond, letting her words hang in the air. "He took what little money I had left and disappeared," she continued, her voice trembling. "Left me with nothing." I crossed my arms, watching her carefully. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for her, but another part, perhaps a bigger part, felt a grim sense of satisfaction. She had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. "I thought about reaching out to you," she said after a long pause, "but I didn't think you'd want to hear from me." "You were right," I said bluntly. She flinched at my words, but I didn't regret them. Hannah had spent years tearing me down, dismissing me, and treating me like an afterthought. I wasn't about to let her rewrite the past just because she was finally facing the fallout of her own decisions. She trailed off, tears welling up in her eyes. I wanted to say I'm sorry, James. For everything. For how I treated you. For the way things ended. You didn't deserve any of it. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Her apology was unexpected, and though it was long overdue, I could tell it was genuine. I appreciate that, I said finally, my tone measured. But an apology doesn't change what happened. It doesn't undo the years I spent trying to fix something you'd already decided wasn't worth saving. I know, she whispered, wiping at her eyes. I wanted you to know that I regret it. All of it. I nodded, feeling a strange mix of emotions. There was a time when hearing those words would have meant everything to me. But now? Now they felt like an echo of a life I'd left behind. Hannah, I said, my voice soft but firm. I've moved on. I've built a life for myself, one that doesn't include the pain or the chaos of the past. I hope you can find a way to do the same. She looked at me, her expression a mixture of sadness and acceptance. You're a good man, James, she said quietly. I hope you find happiness. I already have, I replied, and for the first time, I truly believed it. We parted ways after that, and as I walked out of the store, I felt lighter. Seeing Hannah again had been unexpected, but it had given me something I didn't realize I needed: closure. Driving back to the cabin, I rolled down the windows and let the cool breeze fill the car. My thoughts weren't on the past or the pain it had caused. They were on the future, the life I was building, one day at a time. Hannah had been right about one thing. I was a good man, and now, I finally felt like I was living a life that reflected that.